The New York Mets may have just signed their Pete Alonso replacement, and it's Jorge Polanco?
You are Locked On Mets, your daily New York Mets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello to all you amazing Mets fans. You're listening to Locked On Mets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you for making Locked On Mets your first listen every day, and thank you for making Locked On the number one sports podcast network. On the show today, we're going to talk about the Mets' next move. They have signed Jorge Polanco to a 2-year deal. I'll break down the contract and what he brings to the table in the first segment. In the second segment, I want to talk about what this means for the rest of the Mets infield. Then in the final segment, I want to contemplate whether this has something to do about a Padres trade that could be in the works. We're going to go through it all, but first, I'm your host, Ryan Finkelstein. I've been covering the New York Mets on this show since the 2019 season. This is the number one daily podcast on the New York Mets. If you want to find any of my written work, you can do so over at justbaseball.com, where I work as the editor-in-chief. Before we get going on the Jorge Palanco news, for all of you devoted everydayers, I want to apologize for being away the last couple of days, and for some of you, if you weren't on social media or you weren't an insider, you might not have known why. I was actually sick, came down with a little bit of a cold on my vacation here. I think I was just honestly run down after being on a trip, driving a bunch, and then, dealing with the Edwin Diaz and Pete Alonso news for a couple days there. And so I just needed a reset. Feeling a lot better now. And actually, I just texted the insiders and told them, hey, I was sick. Sorry that I wasn't around the last couple days. But I'll do a show if any news breaks. And then literally 4 minutes later, Will Salmon has a report that the New York Mets have signed Jorge Polanco to a 2-year deal. And we now know that deal is worth $40 million. I want to start with the price tag. I'm sort of hoping that we get some type of report coming soon that Jorge Polanco is getting deferred money in this deal, just because that price tag shocks me a little bit. I was expecting Jorge Polanco to get somewhere more towards the $15 million range per year, but I also thought he was going to get a 3-year deal. So maybe this was just the cost of signing Polanco on a 2-year deal, although if we find out that there's some deferred money that takes this down to more $35 million, that would maybe make me feel a little bit better about the price tag. But regardless of price, the Mets are getting a big bat here with Jorge Polanco. That is what they are signing. A guy that, he's been a little bit inconsistent throughout his career. Last year, in free agency, he returned to the Mariners, kind of surprisingly, because his first year in Seattle, he hit .213, .296 on base, .355 slug, only hit 16 home runs. Granted, it was 118 games, but it was a far cry from his best season, which was in 2021, where he hit 33 bombs for the Twins and drove in 98. His WRC+, which is weighted runs created plus, measuring hitters on a league average of 100, was 93 in 2024. So he was a below average hitter, but you look at the 3 years prior to that with the Twins, 116, 118, 124 going from 2023, 2022, 2021. So he has largely been an above average hitter over the past, say 4-5 years. For the past 5 seasons, he has been an above average hitter. So you are getting an above average bat that is going to slot in, according to Will Salmon, at first base and DH. First base is interesting because he has not played first base throughout his career. He has been a second baseman primarily, and last year he was a DH more than anything else. 88 games played at DH, 38 games played at second base, 5 at third, 1 at first. At second base, he was below average. At first base, maybe the defense takes up. To me, this is a move where the New York Mets are making sure they grab a bat as the market is starting to move a little bit, and it gives them more options on the trade market, as we'll talk about a little bit more in the next segment. But it just gives them a guy that you can slot in at second base. You have Marcus Semien, obviously, but if Semien goes down, he's an option. He has some experience at third, so if you have any issues, you can always plug him there. He can get plugged into first base. I'm sure he'll be working on that a lot in spring training so that he can be an option. But ultimately, feels like your DH. That's how I'm reading it right now, because if you wanted to get better defensively at first base, I don't think Jorge Polanco is going to do it, picking up the position on the fly. I think you're better suited making a trade for Wilson Contreras, They're doing some other things. Maybe it's signing Kazuma Akamoto, the Japanese free agent, not Munetaka Murakami, who would bring you a ton of upside with the bat as far as his home run pop. But there's some concerns about the strikeout rate. The concerns about velocity I'm not as worried about, but Kazuma Akamoto is a higher floor player that would probably be a plus defensive first baseman, could honestly be potentially even an average to even plus defensive third baseman. So if you follow up this move with Akamoto, now I sort of see what you're doing. You got a switch hitter in Polanco. Akamoto's a right-handed bat. That could round out the infield. If you trade for Wilson Contreras and you make him your first baseman, that can round out the infield. And Contreras does have some injury concerns. Most of that was because he was a catcher, but even last year he only played, I think, 130 some odd games, even as a first baseman. So it gives you some insurance all over the place. But let's just get down to what Jorge Polanco just did and why he just got paid potentially $20 million a year if there are no deferrals in this contract. Jorge Polanco in 2025 hit .265, 326 on base, 495 slug, 26 bombs in 138 games, 78 runs batted in. His weighted runs created plus was 132. Now, you could have made a case that maybe Ryan O'Hearn would have been a better fit for the Mets because he would have been a more established first baseman. Clearly, he is a first baseman, Ryan O'Hearn, coming off a similar offensive season, not quite as much pop, but a better defender. And so I would have thought O'Hearn was a more likely fit for the Mets than Polanco. At the same time, you are getting a better power bat here, and one that really did shine in October. The overall stats in the postseason were just okay for Jorge Polanco. It's funny because he had some of the biggest moments in the Mariners playoff run, so you remember him as a playoff hero, and he was. He had the walk-off against, I believe it was the Tigers. He also hit 2 home runs in that game against Tarek Skubal. I can't remember if that was the first start for Skubal or the second one, but he went yard twice, and he was the reason that the Mariners won that game because he was the only one that got to Skubal, which is really impressive. And that also shows you what he can do from the right side of the plate as a switch hitter. He had monster numbers as a right-handed batter this past season. Hit .305, 345 on base, 543 slug, and 888 OPS. That is a 150 WRC plus that he posted as a right-handed batter. As a lefty, also strong numbers, 254 average, 321 on base, 481 slug. So his OPS was actually over 800 against both left-handers and right-handers, and a 127 WRC plus. He also struck out a lot less this past year than he did in previous seasons. In 2024, the strikeout rate, nearly 30%. He cut it in half, pretty much. Went from 29.2% all the way down to 15.6%. And that's more in line with who he was earlier on in his career, where that strikeout rate was low. The walk rate always been pretty high. Throughout his career, his walk rate's 8.7%. This past season, it was 8%. Bottom line, cutting through all the numbers, this is a good bat. And if you get the guy that the Mariners had last season, in his age 32 year, he's going to be a good player for the Mets. He can be their DH, and that is a nice first step. But like every single move the Mets have made this offseason, the problem is you're always wondering what's next. Even the Devin Williams move, it was okay, is he the setup man or the closer? Because it's a largely different conversation depending on what the Mets had done with Edwin Diaz. Now we know he's the closer. And I've rationalized that move because I think the cost of acquisition for Devin Williams compared to Edwin Diaz was good. The Mets made a good financial investment. I think Devin Williams on that contract was really a high-value signing compared to what the rest of the market has gotten when it comes to the top-end relievers. You just saw Robert Suarez, since I last recorded, sign with the Braves, 3-year, $45 million deal, so pretty much right in line with what Devin Williams got, but he's 35 years old, so I like Devin Williams on that contract. We also saw Tyler Rogers sign, and he got 3 years with a vesting 4th-year option. I think that would have been a good signing for the Mets. I don't know about that many years for Tyler Rogers, but the guy's probably going to get outs forever. The bottom line is every single move the Mets make, we're just wondering, okay, interesting, but what are they going to do next? Okay, I can kind of see it, but what are they going to do next? And that's where we are here with this one. It's another move where it's, okay, great, but what's coming next? And hopefully when we get through all the what's coming next and we get to the end of the offseason and we look at the Mets roster, we can see how the puzzle pieces fit together and it'll all make sense. Right now, this move, though, I'll tell you, I work at Just Baseball, as I've mentioned, and I got the company group text. The Mets continue to get laughed at for every move that they make. in a group text full of ball knowers. Everyone's wondering, $20 million for Jorge Polanco? What's up with that? Again, deferrals could bring this down. It makes more sense if it does, but it's just another move that's just a bit head-scratching, even if you can say, hey, if the Mets can copy and paste Jorge Polanco's 2025 season in 2026 and 2027, this will be a great deal. But that's a big if because there's been inconsistency throughout his career. Granted, a lot easier to hit at Citi Field than it is to hit in Seattle with T-Mobile Park. It's a much better ballpark suited to Jorge Polanco in that regard because Seattle's one of the toughest places to hit, and he conquered it and hit 26 home runs. So I am lukewarm on this deal. I like it if it's accompanied by a real first baseman taking over for Pete, and Polanco is your backup option all over the infield, but primarily your DH. Now, if he is that, and Mark Vientos is not going to be your first baseman, what does that mean for Vientos and the rest of this team? I'm going to go through what this could mean here in just a minute. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. The World Cup is coming back to North America for the first time since 1994, and with 48 teams for the first time ever, it is going to be massive. But let's be honest, getting tickets is usually the hardest part. That's why the Game Time app is clutch, finally giving fans a real advantage when it comes to snagging seats. With Game Time, you can track price drops in real time, get alerts when great seats open up, and you can buy tickets the moment they hit the app. It puts the power back in your hands and makes going to the World Cup realistic instead of impossible. You pick a game, you tap a section, and you have your tickets locked in within minutes. No confusion, no hunting through the fine print. Prices include fees up front, which I love, so you're not going to get to the checkout window and say, wait a minute, where did that fee come from? Why did my tickets just skyrocket in price? You can also set alerts for teams and matches to make it easy to grab tickets the moment they drop instead of missing out. Take the guesswork out of buying World Cup tickets, every match, every concert or event with Game Time. By downloading the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, download the app, make an account, and use the code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off. Swipe, tap, ticket, go to Game Time. If you're watching on YouTube, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. Help us get closer to our next goal of 16,000 subscribers. So we're going to talk about the Mets and the Padres lining up in a trade in the final segment. But before we get into the Padres specifically, I think when we look at this signing and what it means for the Mets roster, it makes Mark Vientos a lot more expendable. That's sort of the first place that my mind goes. Because let's assume the Mets are not making Polanco their first baseman. That Polanco could play some time at first, but really the goal is for him to be your DH. Well, now where does Mark Vientos find his at-bats? Theoretically, you can roll into camp and say, all right, Vientos, Polanco, Ronny, Mauricio, we're giving you all first base gloves, and we'll see who looks the best. They could do that. But if one of your primary drivers in not bringing back Pete Alonso is because you didn't like his defense at first, and maybe it's just they didn't like the 5-year deal. But again, if that was one of the motivating factors in moving on from Alonso, you're really going to roll Vientos at first base? Mark Vientos will not be a better first baseman, I don't believe, this upcoming season than Pete Alonso. Could he get there eventually? Absolutely. But he's still got to learn the position. He has played in some of the minor leagues, but there's a reason that it never took off to the point where the Mets really considered rolling with Vientos instead of Alonso at first. There's a reason why going into the 2024 season, the 2024 season, they were having Vientos play a bunch of third. Part of it was, of course, the uncertainty that they had at the third base position, but also this guy never really did take to first. And we watched him play a couple games this past season. The footwork was terrible over there. Now, can that get cleaned up with an offseason of work? Absolutely. Does Mark Vientos have a really good arm, which you would think play a lot better than Pete Alonso did at first base, where you don't really need an arm? But I would think that Vientos could turn a better double play than Pete Alonso and could come home better than Pete Alonso, and you would think it can't get worse than throwing the balls to pitchers than Pete Alonso. Absolutely, but I don't know. I'm just not entirely convinced that the Mets are going to say, all right, first base, DH, how are we going to handle this? We got Polanco and Vientos. We're good. Now let's look in other directions. I think that this makes Mark Vientos a lot more expendable in trade talks. And Vientos, as I've talked about on this show throughout this offseason, is exactly what the Padres need. A guy with a ton of upside, plenty of cheap team control that you can stick at first base or DH. For them, a team that doesn't have as many options as the Mets does, who have to be so much more concerned about their finances than the Mets do, Vientos is exactly who they should want. And so that's the first thing that jumps out to me of, okay, maybe this means Mark Vientos is more likely to get traded. Also, you could say this could make Jeff McNeil more likely to get traded. Now, right now, Jeff McNeil is your starting left fielder. But if you were to make a trade for Ramon Laureano, again, we're sort of leading into that next segment of the Padres, then McNeil, even more expendable, whether it's in that trade or a different trade where you can move McNeil, you really are removing that old core of the Mets and you are turning the page into something new. And now you have a guy that can back up Marcus Semien at second base, just like Jeff McNeil would. Let's also talk about Luisangel Acuna, another option at second base. Again, now with Polanco in place, you have even more of an ability to move Acuna and have coverage at second. At third base, you have Polanco. So if Brett Beatty doesn't work out and you had to go there, you could, which also could make Ronny Mauricio more expendable in trades. So in a lot of ways, this does free up the Mets to make the next move, which again gets back to what I was saying last segment. It's another move where David Stearns has made a signing or a trade in the case of the Nimmo and Semien move, where you wonder, okay, so they, with the Nimmo Semien trade, they picked up Semien, he's your second baseman. Okay, that fills that hole, but now who's playing left? When you sign Devin Williams, okay, is he the setup man or the closer? When Edwin Diaz walks and Pete Alonso walks, it's okay, well, how are the Mets going to respond now that they haven't signed those guys back? It's a lot of, okay, we can kind of start to understand why the Mets did what they did, but what do they have cooking? And to me, there's a big trade that's coming. It's the only way that a lot of these moves make sense, is if other things are going to happen. Again, Jorge Polanco as a DH fit is fine. It's fine. If you were not going to get in the market for Munetaka Murakami, which, it's funny, I was thinking about doing a show about that. Now, I think that's kind of irrelevant because Murakami, I don't think he can play third, and you have Brett Beatty. He'd be a first base DH profile, but who knows how good he's going to be as a defender. And the fact that they jumped on this because it was a 2-year deal tells me again that they're very concerned about locking up long-term money. I think the way that David Stearns is trying to operate this team, we have all of these prospects that we want to find a way to work them into the fold. There's every chance that Jorge Polanco is your first baseman in May, or April and May, and then in June it's Ryan Clifford, and that pushes Polanco to DH. So there's the ascension of young players that'll be cost-controlled. There is the long-term money already on the books where every year you have Francisco Lindor and Juan Soto that are taking up about $80 million in payroll. And the uncertainty of what the new rules will be once the CBA gets ratified after this season, when they go through the lockout and then Major League Baseball changes entirely, we'll see what happens. There's so much uncertainty. And there's also an owner in Steve Cohen that while he can spend with the best of them, he doesn't want to keep burning $350 million payrolls year over year over year. He has said that at the beginning of every single spring training when he meets with the media. So as much as fans are pissed off at David Stearns, and rightfully so, Steve Cohen, this has not come from nowhere. This is a plan that like David Stearns is not just operating all on his own, and Steve Cohen is just like any other fan, and every time that he sees the Mets make a move, he's like, what just happened? Why didn't we sign Pete? Like, Steve Cohen's plugged in. If Steve Cohen put his foot down and said, I want Pete Alonso to be a lifelong Met, get it done, they would have been more aggressive in that market. But I think this is, again, overall, if we're looking at all the news of the week, this is moving on to a new core. And Jorge Polanco makes a lot of sense for the Mets because he's coming off a really good season. He's a switch-hitting bat that hit well from both sides of the plate. He's also a fellow Dominican. I'm sure that doesn't hurt when it comes to being part of Juan Soto's New York Mets, right? So it's an interesting move. And again, it begs the question, what's next? And It could be a massive blockbuster trade with the San Diego Padres that lines up needs for both teams. That's where we're going to close the show here in just a minute. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. The NBA is back, and there's no better place to get in on the action than FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. Even if you missed the start of the game or you want to ride the hot hand, FanDuel has live bets on everything from who will score next to fourth quarter comebacks. Plus, you can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay for a shot at a bigger payout. It keeps every game exciting, especially when your team is making that late push. And right now, FanDuel is giving new customers $300 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. So head to FanDuel.com to sign up and play your game with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. Thank you for making Locked On Mets your first listen every day, and thank you for making Locked On the #1 sports podcast network. You're already live, your team every day, but now you can take it up another level and go ad-free. Join the Everydayer Club today and get Locked On Mets with no interruptions, member-only Discord, and more, all for just $5 a month or $50 a year. Go to lockedonmets.supercast.com or check the link in the show notes to learn more. Now, there was a big story that just came out on The Athletic with reporting from Ken Rosenthal and Will Salmon and Dennis Lin, where they were talking about the Mets and the Padres being in active discussions on a potential trade. These are two teams that overlap in a lot of ways. The Padres have a lot of holes to fill. The Mets have a lot of depth. The Padres need to cut payroll. The Mets have the ability to add payroll. So there is a way where these teams can line up, and the players the Mets are interested in include Nick Pivetta, Ramon Laureano, Mason Miller, Adrian Morejon, or Jeremiah Estrada. I want to note on the front end, there's been some ridiculous conversation. I don't even want to call it reporting because it's been like Padres drive time radio shows and Evan Roberts on The Fan. I mean, it's just been some ridiculous. Actually, I think he was talking about trading Lindor to the Dodgers, so that's not even. Regardless, there's been some really ignorant talk that's been out there, naive talk. I don't know if ignorance is the right word, but whatever. There's some people talking about the Mets trading Lindor after everything that's happened. There's no chance of that happening. Or Fernando Tatis Jr. getting traded. Now, I did a show about the Mets trading Fernando Tatis Jr. 3 weeks ago when the offseason rumors hadn't really picked up. And the conclusion I came to was most likely the Padres are not going to move Tatis because you have to get so much value back in return to make that kind of a deal. The Mets would have to trade Carson Bench. I just didn't think that it could actually happen, but it was a fun thought exercise. The reporting from The Athletic says Lindor and Tatis are not on the table. Neither team is trading those guys, so no surprises there. But there's a lot of useful players in that list of Nick Pivetta, Ramon Laureano, Mason Miller, Adrian Morejon, or Jeremiah Estrada. I want to start with the first two because the final three are all relievers. So you got Nick Pivetta, who's coming off a great season. He signed a very interesting contract with the Padres. I can't remember what he made in the first year, but it wasn't much. He's going to make $19 million this year, and then he has, after this season, a 2-year option for $36 million. So he's going to pitch this year. If he pitches as well as he did last year, he's a free agent. So I think for the most part, teams would view this as a rental because if Pivetta pitches well, which you're planning on him pitching well, he's gone. If not, you have 2 more years at a fairly reasonable price for a pitcher of this caliber. He was legitimately an ace this past season, had a great year, and he fits the Mets' desire to look for starting pitchers that can plug a hole in their rotation on more of a shorter-term deal. So that is definitely a great starting block on what the Mets would want in a trade with the Padres. Ramon Laureano would be an answer out in left field. Now, if the Mets made this trade and they went into next season with Ramon Laureano in left, Carson Bench in center, Juan Soto in right, and then they had Polanco at first base with Vientos at DH, and Vientos wasn't in this trade, you could be better, but I don't know. That's an interesting... To replace Nemo and Alonso with Laureano and Polanco, I think you are taking a step back offensively. And defensively, how much better are you really? Laureano was once a great defensive outfielder. He's okay in the corners. He's definitely not a center fielder anymore. It's not like he is head and shoulders better than Brandon Nimmo was out there. Polanco at first base, we'll see. He could be better than Pete Alonso, but I still am not entirely convinced he's going to be your first baseman and not your DH. So, I don't know. The Laureano thing, it makes sense because he's cheap, but I'd rather the Mets trade for pitching from the Padres and sign Cody Bellinger, because then you're getting better defensively. If your outfield prospects take off and let's say you don't trade Jet Williams and Carson Bench, then all of a sudden, if mid-season you got Jet Williams in center, Bench is playing a corner, now Bellinger's your first baseman, Polanco's your DH, well, now I'm seeing a complete team that's great offensively and defensively. So again, these are all moves where it's like, all right, well, what's coming next? What are the Mets going to do? And we'll react to it if a trade happens. But the reason why this makes a lot of sense for the Mets is because regardless of Laureano or Pivetta, even if you went for a reliever trade, I've done many segments on this show where I've talked about these two teams lining up, and I've said, all right, well, what if you traded Vientos for Adrian Morejon? Now, that's a 1-year rental on the reliever side, and I don't know if the Mets would want to give up 4 years of Mark Vientos for Morejon, but I've talked about how Vientos is a fit for the Padres, and Morejon's a fit for the Mets because he's an elite setup man, happens to be left-handed, but he's elite. Plug him right into that back end of your bullpen, and that really makes things a lot better. Well, now, if it's part of a bigger trade, well, let's say you're getting Morejon and Pivetta, a couple of rental pitchers, and you're sending Vientos, and apparently Jonathan Pintaro is receiving some trade interest around the league. Guy that's on the Mets 40-man roster that struck out a lot of batters that some teams might view as a potential starter or a swingman. Maybe he's in the deal. Maybe, Acuna could fit for the Padres as well. Maybe you are throwing in a pitching prospect. It just depends on what you're getting. I think if you're just getting the rentals in Pivetta and Morejon, a little bit tougher to stomach trading a Brandon Sproat. But also in this type of a trade, David Peterson would be attractive to the Padres because he's making $7.5 million instead of Pivetta making 19, and then that frees up more money for them to go out and do other things. If it is Laureano and Pivetta and Morejon coming over, I'm not sure what Morejon is projected to make through arbitration, but I would guess it's above $5 million for sure. Let's call it the same money that Peterson's making. Well, those two contracts wash each other out. Pivetta and Laureano frees up $25 million for the Padres to spend in other deals. So there's just a lot of overlap between these two teams. If you tried to get Mason Miller, that's a completely different conversation. Leo DeVries went to the Athletics. He was, I guess, a Mets equivalent to Elian Pena. So that's a big prospect. Elian Pena, if you're not aware, was the shortstop prospect that the Mets gave $5 million of a signings bonus to last year. So you're just talking about a very high-end prospect that has a ton of potential. And DeVries was a little bit further along where he'd already started to showcase in pro ball what he could do. So the point is, if you're actually talking Miller or Jeremiah Estrada, guys that come with many years of control, the cost of acquisition is going to be steep. But if you get Mason Miller, and all of a sudden Mason Miller's your closer and Devin Williams is your setup man, I mean, now you have a better bullpen. You have honestly, in some ways, a much better bullpen than you had last year. Because Mason Miller, I mean, he is arguably the most valuable young reliever in baseball because of the team control. I think it's still 4 years left of team control in Mason Miller for a guy that throws 105 at times. I mean, it's just, that would be a completely different trade if the Mets could pull that off. But then all of a sudden, now you're probably sending a Brandon Sproat or a Jonah Tong back. And it just depends on how you want to use those trade assets. The bottom line is the Mets have an incredibly deep farm system to trade from, and they have all of these big league pieces they're trying to shuffle around. The Padres, again, they're a fit for David Peterson. They're a fit for Kodai Senga if you eat down the cash a little bit. If you're sending some money the other way to just help the Padres this year, that goes a long way. Just sending the Padres $10 million in cash, whether it is to offset Senga's contract or anything else you do, that moves the needle for San Diego because then it allows them to spend, and they're an attractive free agent destination. They just don't have any money to spend in free agency. So there's a lot of ways that those two teams can line up to make a lot of sense. We can spend more time on this depending on how long these negotiations take. Feels like everything is taken off right now, and so things can happen where we're reacting instead of projecting, but I'll definitely be looking at that as another future show that we can honestly spend an entire 3 segments on and really go piece by piece on which players the Mets should be after and what it would take to get them. The bottom line here, the New York Mets are still a team that has a lot to do, but they have a lot of possibilities. So while you might look at this move in a vacuum of Jorge Polanco signing and say, do I love it? I don't know. To me, it's just a prerequisite for more things to come. And assuming that the big trade happens, whatever it is, I think we're going to look at the final picture and like what the Mets have on their roster. But it's up to this front office to pull it off. And so I'm glad they did something here, because if you kept on waiting and Polanco and O'Hearn signed, you were going to get to a point where there was very few free agent bats that you could really jump on. This is a guy that if he's healthy for a full season, he can hit you 30 bombs, whether that's at DH or at first base, and he can even play second or third depending on what happens throughout the season. So it gives you versatility, it gives you pop, it gives you another switch hitter, and if it matters, it gives you another guy that theoretically could be a nice teammate fit for Juan Soto, because it's another Dominican-born player that comes into the fold, and we saw how well Juan Soto was connecting last year with Jose Siri and Starling Marte, other guys from the Dominican. So that is your recap of this signing. Fun to get back out there. I'm not used to taking a couple days off. I'm glad I was able to rest up, and I feel much better. If there's any other Mets news, I'll still have you covered. Otherwise, I'll have your next show coming on Monday morning. Maybe we're talking Mets Padres again at greater length. But thank you all for tuning in. Make sure you follow, rate, and review wherever you get your podcast. Subscribe if you're watching on YouTube. And thank you for making Locked On Mets your first listen or your first watch every day.